guys are all excited to be joined by Mike Smith, who is just recently became the managing director of Warner Chappell UK. And I guess first, I'm going to give a very brief rundown of Mike's very prolific career. So he began as a talent scout at MCA Music Publishing in the 1980s, and then he went on to become the director of A&R at EMI Music Publishing, the managing director of Columbia Records UK, the president of Mercury Records, and then the president of music at Virgin EMI before moving to Warner Chappell. And throughout his career, he signed artists including, but certainly not limited to, Gorillaz, the White Stripes, Arcade Fire, Mark Ronson, Calvin Harris, Katy, Iggy, Azalea, and the Libertines. So first off, Mike, I was wondering if you could talk about how throughout your career, the image, the positioning, and the relevance of A&R has changed over time. Because I know a lot of people now today, they debate what actually the role of an A&R executive is.
It's interesting because I think you're always looking for what's different and what's the same in terms of how you do your job, be it in marketing like we were just talking about, or in A&R. And I still think I'm doing the same thing I did when I really started to connect with music. And I vividly remember my first real connection with music, watching the Eurovision Song Contest with my mum and dad when I was, God, how old would I have been? Probably about 8 or 9 years old, in 1973 when ABBA won with Waterloo, and just being completely knocked sideways by the song, by the presentation, by the blue cat suits, and just that really left a massive lasting impression. I still vividly remember that evening now. And what's wonderful is that every artist I've signed, I can still vividly remember the first time I connected with them and what it was like. I can remember who I spoke to that gave me the first tip-off to go and check out the Arctic Monkeys or check out Arcade Fire. I can remember the first time Jeff Travis played me a Libertines demo, or the first time that I saw the first videos that Iggy Azalea was doing. And the thing that grabs you, it's exactly the same thing that grabs you when you're a teenager. You just, for me, it's always been about a really distinctive and original voice that you haven't really heard before, but that in some way connects with you emotionally. We talked a lot about emotion on the last panel, and that rings truer in A&R than any other aspect of the music industry. It's that thing that sort of somehow connects with something deep and familiar that you recognize inside you, but feels new and fresh and dynamic, and is something that you can't quite put your finger on, that you've never heard before. I mean, you can put it down to very basic things, like when you're a grown-up and you're doing a job like this and you're trying to quantify everything you do, and you can just go, it's all about a great vocal allied with a really terrific song, and you can add more to it by saying it's about having somebody there that's super charismatic and is a real star and looks fantastic. And the other incredibly useful asset when you're an A&R person is knowing that there's really good managers involved with the talent that you're looking to get into business with. The thing that is the hardest to recognize, and arguably the most important thing when you're entering into a business relationship with somebody, is just making sure that the person you're about to get into business is as ambitious for their talent as you are. And the mistakes I've made in my career have been falling in love with the music or the individual and the talent, but turning a bit of a blind eye to whether they were going to get out of bed the following morning, or ignoring the fact that they've got atrocious management, or that they've got a spectacular drug problem, and we'll get through that, it'll be fine, we'll come out the other side, it'll be okay. And if you're looking at it from a strictly business point of view, working with people, you're incredibly lucky when you have those collisions with people like a Noel Gallagher or a Chris Martin or a Jack White, where they absolutely have got their eyes on the prize and nothing's going to get in their way. And I think a lot of people, sort of like think it's only characters like Jerry Halliwell that are super ambitious, and that's not the case. Picasso was super ambitious, Bob Dylan was super ambitious. Enormous talent and artistic excellence and ambition can go hand in hand. That doesn't always happen, but when you absolutely spot it, that's the most exciting thing. And to be honest, so everything I've just said there was as relevant as when I got my first job in the business in the 1980s as it is today. The tools by which we discover talent have changed, but I think the actual things that we look for in people we get into business, and particularly, I'm looking for songwriters to work with now. They're exactly the same as they were now as they were then. You can see that obviously having somebody that's incredibly media savvy and social media savvy is something that's great and something that you really want to look for. And obviously that was irrelevant in the past. But to be honest, that's all just about ambition. I want to work with people that will just turn up. I want to work with people that will put themselves into every useful situation imaginable. In a way, the things that sort of like seem obvious, have they got a good song? Have they got a unique and distinctive voice? Are they doing something genuinely interesting and that you've never seen before? If they're not doing, why are you even thinking about getting into business with them if that's not there? That's glaringly obvious. My mum should be able to spot all of those things, and she's not a particularly brilliant talent spotter. But the things that it's the intangible stuff that's really hard to spot. That's, I think, where sort of like great A&R comes out, and being able to recognise that, and I think you probably could. I vividly remember the first time I saw Chris Martin with Coldplay at the Bull and Gate in Kentish Town. I've got to be honest, I did find him quite annoying as a performer, slightly irritating man with a really big hairdo, and I think he just finished. He was still at the University of London studying. And I thought the songs were okay. I thought his personality, it left a big impression on you because he was constantly talking at you as much as he was singing. But the thing that I really took away from it was he had an absolutely sublime voice. And he came along at a time when everybody was obsessed with Jeff Buckley in the music industry. And I thought, here is somebody who's got a voice that potentially is on a par with something like that, who can definitely channel emotion like something I haven't seen before, and who clearly has boundless energy. And those are the things that sort of like I took away from it. I had other things that I wasn't quite sure about him. And then the next time I went back to see him again, you sort of like skip over those reservations that you have.
Could you talk more about how you bring that A&R approach to Warner Chappell and the relevance that A&R has to publishing, and maybe like what exactly does it mean to develop a songwriter and what that entails?
It's interesting seeing. I was a publisher for about 17 or 18 years, and then I took a 12-year holiday in records, which was a wonderful way of. It's actually, I genuinely believe was the best way I could become a much stronger publisher, was to spend time discovering what all those people who looked at music publishers and sneered and went, my God, you've got it so easy. And then I went to work at a record company, and I realized why people thought we had it so easier. There's no denying working in records is way tougher than working in publishing. The actual A&R job between records and publishing is very different as well, because the wonderful thing about working as a music publisher is that I think it allows you to exist in a very pure artistic space to a degree. You're working with songwriters, and you're working with those songwriters to create the best possible material, sometimes for them to sing themselves if they're singer-songwriters, or they're bands and they write their own material. And certainly during the first half of my career in music publishing, pretty much the majority of songwriters I worked with tended to be artists themselves. I signed a few songwriters that were writing for other people. I signed Guy Chambers, who had a very successful career writing songs for Robbie Williams. But the vast majority would be bands. And that's wonderful as a music publisher, because you sign a band or you sign a singer-songwriter, and you've immediately got a vehicle for those songs that you're in business with and that you're representing. So you haven't got to run around trying to find a home for those songs. Coming back after working in records, it's completely different. You know, if Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen signed to a major label today, they would be writing with somebody who used to be in a Britpop band in the 90s to help them write better songs. That was a big change. You know, in the 90s, people improved their songcraft by and large by releasing records. And by the time they got to their third record, they'd really learned how to do the job properly. You know, Radiohead were writing OK Computer, Blur were writing Part Life. And, you know, unfortunately, you don't see that kind of development these days. You know, you don't get the opportunity in the major label sector to develop songs like that. And it's very much, you know, you're going in and working with professional songwriters very quickly from the off. And that creates an absolute boon for music publishers. You know, and I'm delighted that, you know, we're getting to work with some of those people that did used to be in those bands in the 1990s, and they're enjoying fantastic careers now as professional songwriters, helping to bring through the talent of younger people. And, you know, I'm not saying one is better than the other in terms of it was great back then and it's not so great now. You know, I think, you know, when you put together a professional songwriter with an up-and-coming singer-songwriter or an up-and-coming band, you get real greatness when those two people are really good songwriters. You know, I think it's very tough to get something great when you've got a professional songwriter and just a vocalist. You're probably not necessarily going to come up with something truly original. And when you have a situation like that, you've usually got 3 or 4 or 5 professional songwriters in a room and then the vocalist. Where I think you can get real magic is where you get people like a James Bay or a Jake Bugg or Rory Graham from Rag and Bone Man. You know, they're all 3 of those artists, I think, are really terrific songwriters. They all collaborate on their records. Their records are probably 50% them, 50% other people's other songwriters. But by collaborating with those other songwriters, they've been able to immediately from the get-go on their debut records produce songs that can connect around the world in a really fantastic way. And that's not to say that they wouldn't have got to that place in the past. And, you know, it's interesting thinking of sort of like if you'd have left Rory Graham to his own devices, you know, his career I don't think would have had the same kind of stratospheric takeoff that it's had, and it's still taken him sort of like 4 or 5 years to get to where he is. But it would be interesting to think of how his career would have developed over 3 albums. But, you know, through careful A&R, and I think Columbia have done an amazing job on the A&R side and the development side with Rory, and they have taken the time and they have given it patience by putting him in with some truly amazing writers and his own genius at songwriting. They've created some amazing songs that have gone on to another level.
So it's really interesting to hear you talking about the different structure of songwriting now, because something else that I and a lot of other people are thinking about are the structure of songs and albums themselves, and the argument that streaming makes albums irrelevant. Now you only have to release singles or like very small EPs. So I was wondering if you could talk to your perspective on the importance or lack thereof of the album.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Jason Eiley was saying last week, I think in Music Week, that, you know, there are 2 businesses at the moment. There's a track business, which is a singles business, which harks back to what Fred was saying in the previous panel before about almost going back to the 1950s, which was a very singles-dominated market, and the album didn't really exist at that time except as a collection of your singles. But there's also an albums business, and it's interesting again, you know, to go back to Rag and Bone Man. You know, that's clear, one of the great things that we've seen is it's an emerging, Rag and Bone Man's an emerging artist, and he sold 117,000 albums in the first week of his campaign. The first week it was released, it sold that many records. And I think that immediately puts a full stop on anybody trying to say that the album is dead as a format. I think it was close to 80,000 people went out and bought a Rag and Bone Man CD on the first week it was released. 80,000 people, wanted to buy a physical CD, a collection of those songs. I think it was at least another, I think it was about 25,000 bought digital downloads of the album. And I think it was only about 4,000 or 5,000 streams of that album. So Rag and Bone Man's an interesting example. Absolutely, people want to buy a collection of those songs. It's not just all about one track, even though that track has been an enormous success. But at the same time that you have a phenomenon like that going on, obviously people are consuming tracks in a very dramatic way, and I think particularly as a new generation comes in and is consuming music, I don't think many sort of like people under the age of music consumers under the age of sort of like 17, 18, 19 necessarily know what an album is. And I know that can sound ridiculous, but I know from my own personal experience with a 14 and 16-year-old daughter, they're only now, and this is obviously living in a very musical household, they're only now beginning to properly connect with the idea of an album. They've grown up listening to radio, and then with the emergence of streaming, they live on Spotify, and they find their music through playlists, and they build their own playlists, and they may take 3 or 4 Arctic Monkeys songs, but even though they're huge fans of the Arctic Monkeys, they don't listen to albums. They'll pull sort of like a couple of songs off the first album. They'll pull 3 or 4 songs off the last album, and that's where they'll sort of like make their Arctic Monkeys playlist. They'll make their own record. So it's absolutely, for them, they see music as being all about tracks. And in terms of how that affects A&R, yeah, it absolutely makes a difference. And I think we're signing certain artists, because we believe they're going to make great albums, and it's still, the great, if you're lucky enough to sort of like spot a talent out there that is genuinely self-contained, there's nothing better than being in business with an artist that is going to give you a 100% controlled album, which is what I used to do a lot in the past. But as I said before, that very, very rarely happens now. But it's still a wonderful thing to sign somebody. Like we've had a bunch of records out recently. We've had the Rag and Bone Man record out. We also this week had the Amy McDonald record out, which she has about 50% of. We've got a Stormzy album coming out next week, which again I think he's got about 40-50% of that record. We will make, we want to have albums in the market. Albums are where we can make, a lot of money. But at the same time as having albums out there, the thing that drives our business more than anything else is, in a way, what's always driven it. It's still very much a hit-driven business. And so when we're looking for people to sign, it's absolutely searching out for the people that you feel really confident can create hit records for other artists, or if they're singer-songwriters for themselves.
Shifting gears a little bit, I was wondering if you could talk to what you think makes a good person working in A&R, or like what the necessary skills are, because I think so historically, the classic person working in A&R just jumps right in without any experience and just gains a lot of experience and expertise just from doing hands-on work directly, regardless of what they did before. Do you think that's still possible now? And in any case, like, what do you think are the required traits or skills needed to succeed?
I think every person that goes into A&R, and it's interesting to see the sort of like notion in the past that you potentially came in without experience. You come in without experience of doing A&R within a record company or a publishing company. And A&R, to be honest, or talent scouting exists everywhere. You know, music promoters have talent scouts, legal firms have talent scouts. You know, there's that concept of A&R exists, I think, right across the music business. But to me, you don't become a talent scout. You either are a talent scout or you're not. You know, I definitely felt I was a talent scout from the moment I really started to connect with music. Of when I was, you know, probably around, like, you know, about 8 or 9 years old, I would be listening avidly to the radio, deciding what I liked and what I didn't like, and then listening to the charts every week to see if those songs that I heard on the radio that I liked or didn't like were going up or down. And I would hope that the songs that I liked went up, and I would hope that the songs I didn't like would disappear. And to me, it was always that competition. I always wanted the music that I loved to be in the charts, and to me, it was like a constant battle to make sure that the music I loved was getting in there and knocking out all the stuff that I hated. And I feel the same way right up to today. That's what I want to do. It's, you know, you can argue it's an arrogant thing because you're just trying to force your own taste onto other people instead of reflecting other people's tastes. It's the only way I know how to do my job. Obviously, you know, you look to what the market is telling you, but I hope that I can always find things within what research and analytics are telling me that I can identify with, and I can, you know, I do believe that music is only good and bad, and I hope that we can always find good music, and I hope that good music can always connect with a broad amount of people. But yeah, I mean, I think I've always, you know, I've hired a lot of A&R people over the years, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but they've always been super passionate about music. They've always been driven to discover new music. I can't imagine how hard it must be to have a job in the music industry if you don't want to listen to music all the time. You know, that's what makes the job good. That's what makes you persevere through stressful times, through times of massive hangovers. It's okay, I'm going to listen to music all day. Every conversation you have is about music, and you never get bored of talking about music. So I think it's having that incredible thirst for new music and for discovery. That's vital. I think it's really important that you like people, that you like musicians. You know, the number of times I'll talk to people and they're cursing out the musicians that they have to work with or the songwriters that they have to work with. I think you need to be super compassionate for them at all the time, because creative people will drive you to distraction, and I think you need, you know, terrific reserves of patience when dealing with them and a lot of understanding. You know, you have to be an amateur psychologist the whole time. You know, particularly, you know, like I said, you know, in records, I always think like in records it's different to publishing. In records they use real bullets. You know, you have to make very important decision in records. If the artist has presented you with an album and there isn't a single on it, you've got to go back to the artist and say, there isn't a record here we can take to radio. We've got to sort this problem out. In publishing, you can go, the album's really, really good, but, you know, maybe it'd be good to write another song, and definitely have a chat with your record company A&R man about it. Whereas the record company A&R man can't be saying, oh, have a chat with somebody else. That record company A&R man's got to sort it out. So, and in order to sort it out, and I think, you know, as a publisher, you're a wuss if you don't get into those arguments. And I'm finding that, you know, myself with one of the artists I work with, you know, we desperately need to get another song onto his album, and we actually think we've got the song, but the artist doesn't like the song. And that's a common problem. You know, you're sitting there and it's glaringly obvious to you what the terrific song for radio is, but it isn't obvious at all to the artist. And so you then have to begin a psychological game of how you persuade the artist to think that it's their idea, that song that they don't like is actually the song that's brilliant for radio. And I've done that many, many times, and it's the hardest thing that you do, but that's what you have to do all the time. And as managers, you have to do that as concert promoters and booking agents, you know. And you're obviously not always right, and often, you know, I think it's vital that you listen to your artist as much as your artist listens to you. But if if you're being told by a lot of people that you work with, and your gut is also screaming at you that this track should be a single, and your artist doesn't think it should be, it's beholden upon you to try and persuade them. And that's, so that quality, that ability to persuade people is very important. But I think, when you start out as a talent scout, you're going out and you're the first person, a creative person, will meet at the company. So that ability to represent your organization really well is important. So, I want to have people that I think are intelligent, articulate, and charismatic, and can get on with everybody. I'm a real stickler for encouraging them to know as much as the people they're going to meet. It's just like, what records have you listened to? How, what's your musical knowledge like? I want them to know that they've got a basic understanding of where music's come from in the last 40 years. I think that's important just as much as it is knowing what's in the top 40 and what the new emerging music scenes are. And I think, it's important for me that, they've got a very good pop culture knowledge, that they know what's on in the cinema and in the theatre, that they know what's going on in news and politics, because the people that they're going to want to get into business with are going to want to talk about all those things. You can't, if your interests are limited to going to the pub, going to the gym, and going to see the occasional gig, you're probably not going to make a great talent scout. You need to be, I think, a pretty well-rounded individual. And I think it's also important, if you're running a team of A&R people, without wanting to be glib and, go on about diversity again, but I'm going to. I think it's really important that your team should reflect your audience, and it needs to be a good, sexual, racial, ethnic mix, and a variety of ages. Just get your team should be as mixed up as the people you're trying to sell records to.
So talking about trying to reach a broader audience, what do you think about different strategies for genre? Like, do you think that A&R works differently across different genres, or is it is it becoming more similar across the board?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You will work differently when you're working with an artist like Chainsmokers to the way that you'd work with an artist like Radiohead. There are some artists that we work with that are extremely hands-off. You can just, pretty much check in. They're going into the studio. They've got a very strong sense of what they want to do. A band like Elbow that we look after, they've got a very clear idea of how they want to make their records. We can have conversations with them about the kind of record they're thinking of making. You can make suggestions, but ultimately they're four individuals who've got a very clear sense of their own destiny and how they want to steer their own career. Then there are other new artists that are maybe coming into the business for the first time, and you really can have an important influence on their careers and the way in which they choose to shape their career. And that's an awesome responsibility. And I've got to be honest, particularly in my last job when I was working at Universal, at Virgin, I was working with a young Irish band called the Strypes. And when I started working with them, they were essentially a blues covers band, and they loved the blues. And they'd discovered a band called Dr. Feelgood from the late 70s through a Julian Temple film called Oil City Confidential, which was a documentary about this band called Dr. Feelgood. And when they saw this band, it absolutely galvanized them into, this is the band we want to be, and we're going to be a 21st century 15, 16-year-old version of this band. And this is what I encountered, and I encountered this absolutely supercharged R&B band that looked great and had a really focused sense of who and what they were. And I thought, this is so exciting, this band could be amazing. And I talked to them, and I discovered that they were into, more contemporary bands and what have you. And they were playing covers. And I guess as I got involved with them, it was very much about, right, we should try and broaden things out. And I did that thing, we need to move away from just playing covers because their audience when I first met them was made up much more of older people than younger people, and it was just like, this is crazy, you're a bunch of teenage kids, you should be playing to teenagers. So I was all for about encouraging them to write their own songs. I tried to bring in outside songwriters. They didn't want to work with outside songwriters. And it did get quite hard and quite challenging working with a young band and trying to persuade them to go down particular routes. And maybe as a result of that, I found that sort of like the things that I was gravitating towards in terms of what I was signing after that experience of having worked with a bunch of teenagers was very much looking at bands that had been established in the past and were coming around again. So I signed people like the Libertines and Squeeze and the Chemical Brothers, who'd enjoyed a successful period, but there was an opportunity to work with them again and hopefully encourage them to have the same level of success they had in the past. And it was wonderfully rewarding to work with established artists who did have a clear idea of what they wanted to do. And it was a different sort of like set of skills that you had to bring to them. You know, you were working with people like the Chemical Brothers, and you know, to try and explain to Tom and Ed, who obviously know how to make amazing records. Clearly, guys, you know how to make an amazing record, but this is what we need to do to get onto Radio 1. And you know, I did find it could be just as frustrating as working with 16-year-olds sometimes, in that you were trying to introduce them to work with amazing new talent, and they had very clear ideas of the talent that they wanted to work with. And so you worked with them as much as possible and made sure that you were always accommodating their desires and their wishes, but hopefully were guiding it forward so that you could still make a record that was very relevant for the 21st century. But it's, you know, I think each artist that you work with is quite unique. I don't think there's any kind of like common rules that you can bring to any artist that you work with, apart from always striving to make the best possible record you can, and not being lazy about it, and never going, this will do. Because I think there's a real temptation when we're all, you know, you're seeing particularly in labels these days that there's a need, as the revenue streams are not what they used to be, you make up for that by releasing more and more records. But I think the more records you release, there is a real danger that you dilute the quality of those records. And in the past, you know, you'd have a team of A&R people and they'd each be working on maybe 3 records each year. Now they'll be working on maybe 10 records a year. So the attention to detail can sometimes suffer, and I think you've just got to be super disciplined with yourself and always be going out to make sure, is this the best song? Is this the best production? Is this the best performance? You know, can the mix be better? You know, whenever I hear a song on the radio or you know, you stream a song and you just go, well, that mix not quite right. You just know that there's been a lazy A&R person who's gone, yeah, that's all right, we need to do it, let's just get it out. And that should never happen.
I think it's time for audience questions, so does anyone want to ask?
Hi, thanks. I've really enjoyed your conversation. From working in publishing and at a record label, have you ever had that sort of awkward conversation of maybe you should just stick to being a songwriter? And how early do you have that conversation when it's so hard to break a new artist?
So you've got a singer-songwriter and you realise that they're probably not a pop star, but they can write great songs. Usually you're in a situation where you've got a record company. What will happen is you'll sign a singer-songwriter. There's usually a record company involved as well, and the record company will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting with you in terms of trying to break them. But it becomes quite apparent that maybe this career path for them as an artist isn't working out. And, you know, I've always felt, you know, from where I sit, being a songwriter is an absolutely amazing job. And being an artist is a bit of a nightmare because you're having to get up every day and promote yourself and sell yourself and hawk yourself like mad. And I'm sure for so many people that have an ambition at 16 that they want to be pop stars, they have no idea what they're getting themselves into and how hard it's going to be and how relentless it's going to be and how their life will disappear from their control very quickly. And you need to be a super strong individual to be a successful artist. And that doesn't necessarily, equate with being a creative individual a lot of the time. And I think those difficult conversations of maybe you should just stick to being a songwriter, it usually becomes self-evident because it will usually come on the back of a failed campaign as an artist. And, ultimately, even though she had, a fairly successful career, a songwriter like Sia Furler, I was working with her at EMI back in the 1990s, and she was an amazing person to be around, and a really larger-than-life character and great fun. And I think she made about 3 or 4 artist albums, but they never really took her to the next level as an artist. And the minute she was able to actually devote herself and really concentrate on being a songwriter, it exploded and went off to another level. And again, I think it's obviously very difficult when you've got to turn around to somebody and, suggest, why don't we just concentrate on being a songwriter? You don't actually want to say, because you're 35 years old now and it's really just not going to cut it. You're obviously trying to be as thoughtful and as understanding as possible, because they've had this conversation with themselves before you're having this conversation. Most good songwriters are pretty sensitive, pretty intelligent individuals, and they know, an artist knows when their career is not going the way that it should do, probably a lot quicker than the A&R person does. So I've never found myself pushing on a closed door trying to explain to an artist that they should concentrate on being a songwriter. I think they're usually relieved, and there's so many of the best songwriters around at the moment were artists themselves, and it's because of their experience as an artist that they're brilliant songwriters. They're able to, somebody like Ian Archer, who was in Snow Patrol, his ability to sit down with somebody like a James Bay or a Jake Bugg and explain, look, I appreciate you probably don't want to co-write, and your record company has sent you in here because you haven't got a hit single on your record, and they're hoping that you and I working together is going to work. I get it. I get why you don't want to do that, because I would never have wanted to do that when I went through that process. So let's just muck around and see what happens. No one's forcing you to use the song, and because of them creating a really good informal environment, it actually helps them to be the best possible songwriters they can be, because they've had that experience of being an artist.
2 more questions. Great.
2 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
Oh, 2 more minutes. Okay.
I'll be quick.
I guess.
Hi, Mike. You mentioned earlier on about the importance of good management behind a writer and an artist. What do you look for in the management team that gives it the thumbs up from your perspective, and what are the red flags from an early stage that you can detect?
It's wonderful to work with people that are experienced. It's, if a management team has got a proven track record, if they've broken an artist globally before, you learn so much more by doing it right than you do by doing it wrong. So, yeah, experience, intelligence. That's not to say, and I'll never ever dismiss a new manager that's coming along, that's walking into the room and going, look, I haven't done this before. And we've all been that person, and I certainly was that. But I started out managing artists before I got into A&R. The red flag, to me, the red rag to a bull is when somebody walks in and you immediately know when they're bullshitting and they're pretending that they know everything and that they know everybody, and it's glaringly obvious to you that they don't. And that's what I can't abide. I want them to constantly ask questions. I want them to come to us and sort of like say, look, I'm new to this. I don't pretend that I know all the answers. And you can help them and guide them. And probably the best advice you could give to a brand new, inexperienced manager is, why don't you go in with a more experienced team and learn from them? But yeah, I hate it when when people are trying to wing it and they won't admit that they're trying to wing it. I haven't got any problem with an inexperienced manager as long as all of their intentions are good. But when they're just trying to do it and pretend that they can do it so they don't look stupid to the artist, that's a problem for me.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Mike, Jerry, thank you very much indeed for that fantastic setup.
Thank you very much.